even if it's slightly, it's super noticeable. And the reason this matters is it's distracting to the eye and it will break the connection and the engagement with your audience. When you nail all of the settings and the gear, the more obstacles you can remove for your audience, the easier it will be for them to engage with you. Hey, if you're new here, my name is Brian Miller. I'm a former professional magician turned author, speaker, podcast host, and consultant. And welcome to the channel. So 2020 is the year you're gonna start a vlog, or maybe you already have a vlog and you just wanna revamp it a little bit. Well, in this video, we are going to talk you through all of the different settings, the strategies, the mindset, and the gear that you're going to need to do that. But it's really worth noting before we do this, you don't need any of the advice that I'm about to give you in this video. You don't need anything I'm gonna tell you or anybody else on YouTube is gonna tell you that you need to start a vlog. All you need is the phone in your pocket, hit record, say something interesting, say something meaningful, upload it to YouTube, and go. The purpose of a video blog is to connect with an audience, to engage with people, to share your perspective, to get their perspective, to learn new things and create a sense of understanding together. If you can weave a network of people who trust you, not necessarily always agree with you, because connection is not about agreement. Connection is about understanding. But if you can weave this network, this tribe of people who are interested in what you have to say, willing to engage in a dialogue with you, and go on the same journey that you're on, you've got a vlog. And whether 50 people are watching it, or 5,000, or 50,000, or 5 million, the point is the community. And all of the strategies, the gear, and the settings that we're gonna talk about in this video are merely tools that we use to accomplish that goal. The point of this video is not to show you how to gain hundreds of thousands or millions of subscribers. There's plenty of great content on the internet if quantity is your goal. If your goal is to see the number go up, there's lots of ways to do that. No, the purpose of this video is to give you a bunch of tools and really a foundation for understanding how to go about vlogging in 2020, producing, video blog content for the internet. So we are gonna talk about the gear, cameras, microphones, stuff like that. We're gonna talk a lot about strategies and mindset, but we're also going to talk about the specific settings. And there will be chapter links to all that stuff in the description of this video so you can skip around. This video is not really intended for you to watch straight through. I mean, if you do, that's great. I'm glad you found it interesting enough to do that. But this is really supposed to be a resource for you to bookmark and come back to as many times as you need to, and to continue coming back to grow and learn and reinvent yourself over the next year or two. But let's be honest, this is really why you're on this video, to find out how to get a vlog setup going. A camera, what microphone, what settings, how to set up the shots, blah, blah, blah. So, okay, let's start with the settings. First and foremost, you do not need an expensive camera. This isn't even that expensive. This is a G85 from Panasonic. You do not need an expensive camera or expensive microphones or expensive anything to vlog. Again, you can use the thing in your pocket, right? You've got a smartphone, whatever smartphone you have. If it's within the last, I wanna say 4 years, 5 years, it's more than good enough. And you know what? If it's older than that, it's probably more than good enough for what you're trying to do. As we'll talk about later in this video, audio is actually a little bit more important than the video quality itself. But there's a law of diminishing returns when it comes to the video technology, and particularly with smartphones. The smartphone I have is a Samsung Note 8. 2-3 years ago, it was like a premier smartphone. It was almost $1,000. It was the best you could get. It's 2020 now. I'm 2.5 generations behind, almost 3 generations behind. The thing still films in 4K, it does slow motion, it does everything you could want it to do. So again, you don't need fancy or expensive gear to vlog. You need an opinion, you need a perspective, you need to connect with an audience. Again, I know I had to get that all out of the way. Let's talk about the actual settings though. So if you're using a camera, then you're going to have a variety of different options for vlogging. The first thing you want to do is anytime you're in video, anytime you're filming video and not taking photos, if you have a real camera, whether it's a point and shoot or an interchangeable lens camera, whether it's micro four thirds, APS-C, full frame, doesn't matter. Make sure the dial or whatever version of a dial your camera has is set to movie mode. There is a specific movie mode that you want to make sure that your camera is set to, which will give you all of the video options when you're filming. The next thing you really need to decide is, are you going to film in automatic, partially automatic, or full manual? So every camera's got some version of an auto mode. Your phone probably only does auto unless you get a third-party app for the manual controls. All digital cameras have a full-blown automatic video mode. A lot of times your camera will list it as P, sometimes it'll say auto. When you do that, it'll just take care of all the settings for you. Your camera will determine the white balance, the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, all the things that you may not even know what the heck I'm talking about yet. Your camera will decide in the moment how bright or dark it should be and what all the different settings should be, what color it should be, blah, blah, blah. So if you don't want to learn anything about cameras, you're not into cameras, you just have something to say and you want the shortest distance, the least amount of resistance between you and getting that message out to the world, put your camera in freaking automatic mode or use your smartphone and go get it. But if you want more control, if you want to start taking advantage of the filmmaking aspects of creating videos for the internet, then you're going to want to look into a partially automatic or full manual mode. So what are the partially automatic modes? Well, there's aperture priority and there's shutter priority. So this is a good time to talk about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which is what we call the exposure triangle in photography and in filmmaking. The exposure triangle is how you set the exposure of your image. The exposure is how bright or dark your image is overall. 3 different controls that we use to set the overall brightness or darkness, the exposure of our image. Aperture, which is how wide or how closed off your lens is. So that allows it to let in more light or less light. Aperture is measured in f-stops. So you'll see f numbers like f2, f8, f1.8, f16. The f-stop tells you what the aperture is. The lower the f number, the lower the f-stop, the brighter the image is, and the more background blur you get. The lower the f-stop, the brighter the image, and the more blurry background. And here's an example of changing the aperture while keeping the exposure the same. So as the aperture opens up, you'll notice the background getting much blurrier. Have a look at f11 versus f4. See how much more blurry the background is? Then we have shutter speed, and shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. You'll see numbers like 1/50th, 1/60th, 125th, 1/500th. When you're a photographer, the shutter speed is how fast the shutter goes. When you're a videographer, you have a lot less control over the shutter speed. I mean, you can do whatever you want to it, but a lot less control when it comes to making your image, making your video feel cinematic, feel film-like. So to get that cinematic film-like look, the look that is most natural to our eye, we just have to double the frame rate to get our shutter speed. Okay? So let's say you're shooting in 24 frames per second. That means that your camera is creating video out of 24 still images per every 1 second. 30 frames per second would be 30 images per 1 second of footage. 60 frames per second would be 60 still images per 1 second of footage, and so on and so forth. The only 2 frame rates you really need to worry about right now are 24 and 30. 24 will give you a more cinematic look. The history of cinema has almost exclusively been shot in 24. 30 frames per second is fairly standard for YouTubers. A lot of YouTubers using 30p. And that's also kind of the soap opera look. Most television is in 30 frames per second. So really just decide, you want it to look a little bit more cinematic, or do you want it to look a little bit more internet, a little bit more TV? Your shutter speed should be twice your frame rate. So if you're filming at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/60. Okay? So 30 frames per second, you should set your shutter speed to 1/60. You set your shutter speed, and then you leave it alone. You leave it alone. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 48, 1/48. but most consumer grade cameras don't have 1/48 as an option, so 1/50 is the closest we're gonna get. So if you're filming in 24 frames per second, set your shutter speed to 1/50. If you're filming in 30 frames per second, set your shutter speed to 1/60. Let's get back to talking about partially automatic video modes. So there's aperture priority or shutter priority. Aperture priority means that you manually set the aperture and your camera will determine all the rest of the settings for you. So you set, okay, so let's say you're in a low light situation and you really, really want to make sure that you have your lens as wide as it goes, as open as it goes, because remember, the wider it is, the lower the f-stop, the more light is coming in, which means the better your camera will do in low light situations. So if you're in a low light situation, you probably want to set your aperture as wide as it goes, the lowest f number your lens is capable of doing. Different lenses have different maximum apertures. So some lenses are darker at their brightest than others. So if you want a really bright lens, you're looking for an f1.2 or 1.4, 1.8. I would consider anything f2.8 and under a bright lens, reasonably so. Now, just for the real filmmakers out there, the real photographers, yes, I know that the aperture is subject to the equivalency problem, micro four thirds, APS-C, and full frame sensors. The sensor size makes apertures act differently. Yes, I'm aware of that. We're gonna skip that for this video. It's not important for this video. Ugh, had to change leg positions there. My leg's going to sleep. Woof. So again, if you're an aperture priority, you set the aperture and then your camera determines all the rest of the settings for you. So if you're in a low light situation, you might want to specify aperture priority to just make sure your camera keeps as much light coming in as humanly possible, and then you just don't worry as much about what it's doing to the shutter speed. Is it going to keep that perfect film-like look? No, probably not, but at that point, you're making a YouTube video, you're making a vlog. Again, the purpose is to connect. Just use the tools to help you get there. Or if you really want to make sure that you keep a consistent look across your entire video, then you might want to go to shutter priority, where you determine the shutter speed and you let your camera determine all the other settings. So if it's really important to you to keep that 180 shutter rule going, to keep your shutter at twice your frame rate, then go to shutter priority, go into 1/50 for 24p or 1/60 for 30p, and let your camera determine all the rest of the settings for you. So that's aperture priority and shutter priority. I usually recommend doing one of the partially automatic modes for when you're running and gunning. When you're running around a lot, you're going into different situations. Let's say you're outside and you're vlogging and you're in the woods, and sometimes it's dark when you're filming into the woods. Sometimes the light is the sun is just hitting you hard from above when it peeks through the trees. Maybe choose one of the partially automatic modes because you don't have to be fiddling constantly every 3 seconds with all of your settings while also filming yourself, remembering what you're supposed to be talking about, connecting with the audience, and all of those things. For what it's worth, full auto is, again, when you just want the camera to get out of your way and you just want to focus on what you're saying and your engagement with the audience. Especially use full auto when you're running and gunning in tons of different locations. So if you're going from inside to outside, from the shade to the bright sunlight, if you're showing stuff and then turning it back to you and then showing stuff again, you can't possibly be changing all the different aspects of the exposure triangle in real time while keeping up the engagement with your audience. Just set your camera to auto. Is it gonna be perfect? Is it gonna look like a film? Of course not. If you wanted that, you'd have a film crew. Set it to auto. Okay, but when should you use full manual? Well, you should use full manual if you're crazy enough to want to deal with the entire exposure triangle at all times, or when you're doing something like this, which is a studio shot. If you're vlogging, and there's nothing that says vlogging has to be running around the world like Casey Neistat or Peter McKinnon, right? I mean, that's great, do that, but this can be vlogging too. There's a lot of phenomenal video vlogs that are simply someone sitting and talking to the camera. There's no B-roll, there's no change in environment. They just have something really interesting to say, and they've found an audience of people who want to hear what they have to say and want to engage with their ideas. This can be a video blog. There's nothing that says it can't be. Should you be in that situation, you definitely want to be on full manual. You want to set everything, the exposure triangle and the white balance. So what haven't we talked about yet in the exposure triangle? We talked about shutter speed, we talked about aperture, but we haven't talked about ISO. Some people call it ISO, some people call it ISO. Call it whatever you want, nobody cares.
Nobody cares, Sean. Nobody cares.
The ISO is the digital brightness. It's just cranking up the brightness digitally in your camera. What happens when you increase the ISO is you introduce more and more gain. Gain turns into grain. Grain is that noisy looking stuff that you usually see in the background, in the shadows, and the darker spots of the video. That noise, that pixelation kind of looking thing, that's what happens at high ISOs. Now, every camera has a base ISO. This one happens to be 200. A lot of them have a 100 as their base ISO. In theory, if you set your ISO to the base ISO for your camera, it will have the cleanest possible image. But it's not always possible to leave your ISO at its base. In fact, it's often you have to crank up that ISO to get a good looking image, to get an image that has enough brightness, that's properly exposed, where everything looks about the right level of bright and dark, like this image is right now. See, right now, I'm not at the base ISO. This camera right now, I have a prime lens on. A prime lens means it doesn't zoom, it only has one focal length. Zoom lenses zoom lenses zoom, and prime lenses only have one focal length. This prime lens has a maximum aperture of f2.5. Okay, so that I would consider a bright lens, but it's on the darker side of a bright lens. I have it all the way open at f2.5. I want the most amount of light coming in I can possibly get from that lens. The more light you have coming in, the less you have to crank your ISO, the less grain or noise you have to introduce. I have my shutter speed set. Wow, that's hard to say. I have my shutter speed set to 1/50 because I'm filming in 24 frames per second, and my ISO is set to 250. The base ISO of this camera is 200, but when I set it to 200 at f2.5 and I locked in my shutter speed to 1/50, the image was just a little underexposed. It was just a little underexposed. Actually, I can probably change it right now. I'm operating that camera wirelessly, so let's see. Can I change it? Will everything blow up? Let's go 200. Okay, this is 200 ISO, and when I was looking at my phone, which is wirelessly, remotely operating my camera right now, when I was looking at the image, it looked just a little bit underexposed. It just looked a little underexposed. So cranked that up to 250, and this looks better to me. I'm so afraid. Okay, still recording, still recording. Still audio, still audio, even better. So now we know the three different aspects of the exposure triangle. We've got the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. But as I said, in video, we almost always lock down our shutter speed. So if you're in full manual, you only really have two controls. You have your aperture and you have your ISO. If you're using an interchangeable lens camera, there's a good chance that if you're new to this, you bought a camera that had a kit lens. A kit lens is the lens that comes with the body of the camera as a kit. That's why we call it a kit lens. Kit lenses typically have a pretty decent zoom range to give you lots of options, but they are typically pretty dark, often starting at f3.5 or f4 and quickly closing down even darker, what we call variable aperture, where your lens has different apertures throughout the zoom range. A variable aperture kit lens will often go from 3.5 to 5.6. So it's 3.5 at the wide end, and the further you zoom in, it gets eventually to its furthest zoom point, it'll be 5.6, which is pretty dark, especially in a Micro Four Thirds or an APS-C camera when you're not dealing with a big giant full frame camera. So in that case, if you're dealing with a kit lens and you've already locked in your shutter speed and you're working in manual, if you have like f3.5 or f4 or something, you're gonna have to crank your ISO to 800, 1000, maybe even 1600. By and large, you wanna keep your ISO as low as you can to avoid that grainy image. Most consumer grade cameras really show grain after about ISO 1600. You'll start seeing it by 800, but it gets pretty prominent around 16. And if you jump up to 3200, the image is going to start to look like crap. But having said that, if the only way for you to get the image, because you don't have studio lights or you don't have broad daylight, you're filming in if there's no other way for you to get the image, just crank the ISO, get the image, and make sure you stay engaging and connected with your audience. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All right, I just wanted to set the camera down for a second to do a quick recap. So we've talked about frame rates. 24 frames per second is the film look. 30 frames per second is the TV look, the soap opera look, the very commonly YouTuber look. And after you do that, you have a couple of options for your exposure. Set your camera to auto, don't think about it, let it do whatever it wants, it's not gonna look cinematic, who cares? Make your content. Or partially automatic, so you can set it to shutter priority. Shutter priority, where you want to make sure that you maintain a consistent look over the course of the video, and the camera does everything else. Or aperture priority, where you wanna make sure you control the amount of light coming in and let the camera control everything else. And then there's full manual, where you have to, on your own, at all times, every single time the exposure changes and you have to recorrect, you have to deal with the shutter speed, which you should mostly be leaving alone anyway, the aperture, and the ISO, which is the digital noise, the digital brightness level of the image. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about is white balance. White balance is, how do you explain white balance? It's my baseboard heaters. Can you hear that? Because I'm using an omnidirectional lav mic, which means you probably can hear my baseboard heaters right now. They're clinking and clacking around. They're trying to heat the house up because it's cold outside. So the white balance is basically making sure that your camera is seeing white as white. There's lots of different types of light. There's daylight, which is what I've got right now. Now, I don't actually have daylight, it's dark outside, but I have lights on me that are daylight balanced. They are simulating daylight. If you're in the shade, it's gonna be kind of like daylight, but it's gonna be a little bit off from daylight. It's not quite daylight. Then there's the kind of warm tungsten lights. We typically see these indoors. Those are the kind of orangish lights that we see in our indoor lamps most often. And then there's fluorescent lights, and there's all different types of light. And depending on what type of light you have in your scene, it's going to affect the color of the entire image that your camera is capturing. And the goal is to set the white balance in the camera so that you're capturing an image that offsets what it's doing to the white. So if you want to make sure that your whites look white, you need to set your camera's white balance to whatever scene, whatever type of light is the most dominant light in the room. So if you're outdoors in broad daylight in the middle of the day and there's no shade, you want to set the white balance in your camera to daylight. If you're outside in the day and you're under a tree, or if you're in the woods, you probably want to set it to shade. If you are filming indoors and there's a lot of orange, warm tungsten lights, you set it to the tungsten setting. Here's an example of how different light sources play off of the white balance. You'll see we've got indoor lights and our white balance is set to tungsten, so white looks correct. But here we've got daylight and our white balance is still set to tungsten, so the whites now have a bluish tint. To get rid of that, we change the white balance to daylight, making the whites look white again. You can do auto white balance. This works well for photographers. It doesn't work as well for videographers. And the reason is, over the course of a scene, your camera might randomly decide that it's going to shift the white balance a little bit because it's set to automatic. So if the color of the room shifts, or if the camera notices that there's a tungsten light in the background and it gets fooled into thinking that's a dominant part of the scene, it might try to recorrect. And so I made this mistake tons of times in my early videos. My first year on YouTube, I totally didn't realize I needed to be setting my white balance to manually, because I thought, well, if I just let it do, if I put my white balance on auto, it'll just do it for me. And it does, but it'll change over the course of a video. And that doesn't sound like a problem until you go to edit. When you make a mistake and then you cut something out and then you realize that your edit point when you have one clip and then the next clip that the color of the entire video has changed. Even if it's slightly, it's super noticeable. And the reason this matters is it's distracting to the eye and it will break the connection and the engagement with your audience. Anything, see, that's where the settings and the tools and the strategies here really come into play. When I say that they're just, the gear and the settings, they're just tools to help us engage with our audience. What I mean is when you nail all of the settings and the gear, then your audience has the least amount of barriers to the message that you're trying to get across, to the content, to the entertainment, whatever it is you're trying to give them. Whatever the experience is that you're going for, the more obstacles you can remove for your audience, the easier it will be for them to engage with you. So if your camera's in full auto mode, then the white balance is on automatic and you just, again, whatever. That's a totally different mindset. Auto, get the camera out of the way. I don't care about the camera, I don't care about the gear, I just want to do this. Fine, just do that. Do you. Who cares? Doesn't matter. But if you're going to be in any of the manual modes, either full manual or the partially manual, partially automatic modes, set your white balance manually unless you're running in and out of different situations. Again, if you're inside and then you're running outside, then you're under a tree and then you're over here, and then you might want to leave it on automatic because otherwise you're going to have to change your white balance constantly. But if you know you're going to be vlogging in the bright daylight for the next 10 to 15 minutes or half an hour or whatever, set your white balance to daylight. If you know you're doing a studio shoot, set your white balance to whatever lights you're using. I'm using daylight balance, so they're daylight. But if I were using tungsten lights, I would be setting it to tungsten, right? Because I know I'm gonna be in this situation for the entirety of the video, so I wanna lock down the white balance. Let's talk about autofocus. Autofocus is really important for vlogging. And the reason autofocus is really important for vlogging is that if you're running around and you're holding your camera and you're in different situations constantly, if it's closer to you, it's further away. If you sit it down and then you talk and then you pick it back up again and then you want to turn it around and show something and then turn it back, if you're in manual focus, you have to be constantly at every moment adjusting the focus ring, and that's going to be an impediment. An impediment? It's going to get in the way of you producing the content and keeping your thoughts going. So by and large, vloggers need really good autofocus. Some camera companies do great autofocus. Some of them do lackluster autofocus. The best autofocus comes from Canon and Sony. Canon's dual pixel autofocus is an absolute marvel. I used nothing but Canon cameras for the last 3 years. I only, within the last 2 months, switched over to Panasonic for reasons that aren't important in this particular video. I needed unlimited video recording. So I guess that wasn't such a long explanation. Canon's dual pixel autofocus is a freaking miracle. You can run around the frame, you can get closer and further away, you can leave the frame, you can come back in. It will keep you in focus all the time and it will never drift. It's amazing. And Sony has caught up from what it looks like. I'm not a Sony user. It looks like their autofocus is pretty spectacular. So if autofocus is like really, really, really important to you, if it's like that's like the thing and you don't want to worry about focus or wonder if it's in focus or worry about making sure that Canon, Sony, those two brands, you got to go there. If you can handle doing a little bit of manual focusing combined with autofocus, then it opens you up to some of the other brands. Panasonic has lackluster autofocus. There's technical reasons for that. Now for video, you can do manual focus. Now the problem is, if you're sitting further away from the camera like I am, I'm like almost 4 feet from the camera right now. Sometimes you're even further away from it. If you can't reach it, you can't adjust the manual focus. Well, unless you have a Panasonic system which has remote access. Let's see if I can do this. Remote access where I can control absolutely everything from over here. I just realized that because I'm filming in manual focus, if I go like this, nothing changes. I have this camera in manual focus, and I can control the manual focus from, let me set this down for a second. I can control the manual focus from the app. If I wanted it to focus on the background for a sec, actually, you know what? Let's see if I can make this happen. Ready? Let's see. I'm gonna get to focus on this. So, if I wanted you to see that, I would tap the autofocus button. So it just auto-focused in manual mode. Look at this. This is in focus now. But now I'm not in focus because it's focused on where the camera was. It's focused, I think, on my hand, right? So I'm in manual focus. If I tap the autofocus button in manual mode, did you get me? And now I'm back in focus. Now where my hand is not in focus, but I'm in focus again. And isn't that a glorious, glorious thing? If you know your camera really well, you can set manual focus and then come and sit down, or you can put a stuffed animal in the place where you're gonna sit and focus on that and then come sit down. So autofocus, manual focus, it really depends on your situation. Most vloggers are going to want some pretty good autofocus, in which case you want to go to Canon or Sony. If you're willing to deal with a little bit of manual focus, the Panasonic cameras offer so many exceptional video features. It's just that they don't have fantastic continuous autofocus. Now, I keep saying continuous autofocus. You need to figure out how your camera, Canon, Sony, Panasonic, all these different cameras, they have different descriptions, different names, different labels for autofocus. In the Panasonic cameras, like I have, the autofocus mode, right, so I'm in AFC, which is autofocus continuous mode, and then I have the continuous autofocus turned on. There's lots of different ways that the camera companies figure out how to call the different autofocus modes. What you need to do is go into your camera and find something that basically says continuous autofocus or tracking autofocus. Turn that on, hope for the best. If you have tracking autofocus, which is basically means that if you tap the screen or you choose something, it's going to try to follow it around the frame. Canon's dual pixel does tracking like flawlessly. If you just tell it to track your face, it will keep your face in focus all the time. If there's a car moving and you tap the screen and it'll keep the car, and if there's a skateboarder and you tap the skateboarder, it'll keep them in focus. It's amazing. The Panasonic will not do that as well. From what I've heard, Sony does it pretty well. So, like I said, two different ways to do it. Autofocus, that's great for running and gunning. If I am out running around the world with this, I'm probably going to be using a continuous autofocus unless unless I'm really, really good at keeping my arm the exact same length, in which case I could manual focus the lens, and then I could just keep my arm exactly the same distance from me while I walked around. The advantage to using manual focus is you know exactly where it's focused, and it's not going to hunt. It'll never lose focus unless you move out of the plane of where the camera has been focused to. So if you're just going to sit and talk like I am for half an hour, 45 minutes, oh crap, this is gonna be a long video. If you're just gonna sit and talk for 45 minutes or an hour and you're really not gonna move, set it to manual. You don't have to worry about it losing track of you. If you think you're gonna get clever and cute and come up here and come back here and you're gonna run over there and you're gonna leave the room and come back and sit down, then yeah, you're gonna need some continuous autofocus or to continually be refocusing manually. Let's talk about blurry backgrounds. Yes, the holy grail of YouTube vlogging. Everybody wants the blurry backgrounds. All right, so this is called bokeh. Bokeh, depends on how you want to pronounce it. B-O-K-E-H, bokeh, otherwise known as blurry background. How do you get it? Two different ways. One, the wider the aperture, the more blurry background. The wider open the aperture, the more blurry the background. The more you close off the aperture, the more depth of field you're gonna have, the more it's gonna keep in focus. So when you have a super shallow depth of field, it means that it's only keeping a little bit of the image, of the depth of the image in focus. A deep depth of field means it's keeping a lot in focus. So if you're filming a landscape, you probably want a deep depth of field. You want there to be the grass and the mountains, and you want most of that stuff in focus because you're trying to show off a landscape. If you're just doing a talking head or a portrait, you probably don't want everything behind you to be in perfect focus. Now, right now I kind of have a middle ground. I'm at f2.8, so I'm in focus. It's got a fairly shallow depth of field, but not too shallow. Like it's not really shallow because you can still see what's behind me. It's blurred out, but it's not blurry. You can totally see that I've got my speakers, that I've got my painting over here, right? You can see the stuff behind me, but because it's blurred a little bit, it's not distracting. It's not competing with the focal point of the video, which of course is me, because I'm doing a talking head. But if I had a lens that was an f1.7, which I do around here somewhere, or an f1.4 or a 1.2 or a 0.95. Now I don't have any of those with me or at all for the Panasonic system. If I did, it would get blurrier and blurrier back there the lower you could reduce the f-stop. So that's one way to get a blurry background. The second way to get a blurry background is backgrounds get blurrier at longer focal lengths. The longer the focal length, so when I say longer, I mean this is a 14 millimeter focal length. If I was at a 25 or a 50 or a 100, the longer, basically the further zoomed in it is. The longer it's zoomed in, the further it's zoomed, the longer the focal length. How many different ways can I say that? The blurrier the background will be. That is only true when all else is equal. So if every one of your settings stays the same and you just increase the focal length, the background will get blurrier because it's compressing the image. But if you're new to vlogging and you're using a kit lens, which we've mentioned already, kit lenses, first, they typically have fairly dark apertures, right? They usually start at 3.5 or 4, which is not bright. And they have a variable aperture. They close down. They get even darker as you zoom in. What happens is, if you think, okay, I don't have a bright lens because my f-stop is only 3.5, but I want a blurry background. So what did Brian say? He said, if you zoom in, it'll get blurrier. Yes, if you zoom in with your kit lens, it'll get blurrier, but at the same time, the variable aperture will stop down, increasing your depth of field. So as you zoom in with a kit lens, it counteracts the extra blurriness. Like the extra blurriness you would get from zooming in is somewhat counteracted by the fact that the aperture is closing down at the same time. So if you're working with a kit lens, you're probably not going to get a blurry background. The only other way to get a blurry background, though, is to get closer to the lens. So if I come right here and focus, you see how the background gets blurrier? If I come even closer, can it focus on me this close? Oh, it can. Look at, the closer I am to the lens, the blurrier the background is. And if I back all the way up here now, and I tell it to refocus on me, you'll see that because I'm further away from the lens, the background isn't as blurry. Why? Because I'm closer to the background now, right? So the fourth and final way to get a blurry background is to keep the background as far away from you as possible. If you're filming with, even if you have a closed down aperture, if you're at f5, 5.6, which normally would not have a blurry background at all, but the background, but you're filming on a football field where, you know, the background's 100 yards away, the closest thing to you is 100 yards behind you, yeah, it's gonna blur the background because the background's so freaking far away from you, right? So the two primary ways with the camera itself to get a blurry background are open the aperture as wide as it goes. So you're looking for something that's f2 and lower is when you start to really see a blurry background. Zoom in or get a longer focal length prime lens, or ideally get a lens that has a long focal length and a wide aperture, like a 85 1.4 lens is going to have a really blurry background from the open aperture, and it's a long focal length. So there, two for the price of one. That's why people love those lenses. That's why they're used for portraits. And then the two other ways to do it are to get closer to the lens and to get further from the background, which are kind of two versions of the same thing. But the million-dollar question is, how much does it matter that you have a blurry background? It mostly doesn't. It mostly doesn't matter. The advantage to the blurry background is that it keeps the viewer focused on you, the subject, the thing that's actually talking, which, yes, again, is a tool that you can use to keep the connection, to keep the engagement with your audience, but they just don't care that much. People watching videos, they really just don't care about the blurry background that much. They just don't. It's mostly us. We look at it, we think it looks pretty. But sometimes when it's too blurry back there, it's actually distracting. Like if you're vlogging, you probably don't want a super blurry background if you're walking around the world, like run and gun vlogging, not doing this. Run and gun vlogging, like you kind of want people to be able to see what's going on behind you. You want to give them the context of the environment that you're in, because that's part of the story. It's part of the ambiance and the experience that you're creating for your audience. So don't worry too much about the blurry background. Color profile. You may have noticed that your camera has a color profile option. You'll see things like standard, vivid, natural. Choose the one that looks good to you. By and large, you'll be in fine shape with standard. Standard on most cameras is going to give you standard these days really means it's very saturated, it's very sharp, it's very punchy, which if you're just getting into vlogging is probably what you're looking for, right? Let's be honest, that's probably what you're looking for. Set it to standard. If you want something that doesn't look quite as hyper saturated and sharp and contrasty, go for natural. The custom settings and things like Vlog and all that stuff, that's for people who are gonna do color grading in post. Yes, I do color correction and color grading in post, but that's because I enjoy it and I learned how to do it and I spend a lot of time on my videos and my videos are part of my work. If you're just trying to make content that connects with an audience and engages with people and tells a story and shares a perspective, you probably don't want to be color grading your vlog. It will triple the amount of time it takes you to edit the vlog. Slow motion. Boy, we love a slow motion, don't we? We love a slow motion. Well, how do you get slow motion on a real camera? Getting slow motion on your smartphone, if you're using a smartphone, is really easy. Choose the option that says slow motion and, do that. But if you're using a camera, you probably don't have an option that actually says slow motion. So how is slow motion created? Well, slow motion is created by filming at a much higher frame rate than your base frame rate. So if you're making videos in 30 frames per second, if that's your base, all your normal talking stuff is 30 frames per second. If you want to get some slow motion and your camera has a 60 frames per second option, you can film in 60 frames per second, which means you have twice as many frames per second as you need. So if you take those 60 frames and spread them over 2 seconds, you'll have 30 frames per second, but your clip will take twice as long to play. So if you had a camera that was doing 120 frames per second, none of the low-end consumer cameras are gonna do that. You're gonna have to get into thousands of dollars for that. But let's say you have a camera that does 120 frames per second, and you're filming your base in 30 frames per second. You can take that 120 frames and spread it over 4 seconds worth of footage by slowing it down to 25%, right? At 25% of the speed, those 120 frames will take 30, 60, 90, 120. 4 seconds worth of your 30 frames per second, which is why you're able to slow it down and it looks smooth. For me, I film in 24 frames per second. So if I film something in 60 frames per second, I can actually slow it down 40%. I can slow it to 40% because 24 is 40% of 60. 60 frames will get into 2.5 seconds worth of footage in a 24p video. So that's how slow motion works. But what people forget all the time is you can't just change the frame rate. When you change the frame rate, let's say you're filming in 30 and you want to do some slow-mo. So you set your camera to 60, okay? You're doing 60 frames per second now. Remember the shutter rule. Shutter speed has to be twice the frame rate. So you have to jump up your shutter speed from 1/60, which is where it was when you were doing 30 frames per second, to 1/120 in a perfect situation. Now, consumer cameras have 125. They have 1/125. So let's just call it that. You have to jump your shutter speed to 1/125 because that is effectively double your new frame rate of 60p. What happens when you increase your shutter speed? When you increase your shutter speed, everything gets darker. The higher the shutter speed, the darker the image. The lower the shutter speed, the brighter the image. We didn't bother talking about that aspect of the exposure triangle earlier because when we're doing video, we just set our shutter speed to twice our frame rate. But it matters if you're gonna do slow motion because you have to jump up that shutter speed, which is now going to make your footage much darker than it was before. Well, to compensate for that, think about our exposure triangle. If you just jumped up your shutter speed and it's much darker now, you need to find a way to make your image brighter to compensate, to even out the exposure, to make the exposure normal again. What are your two other options in the exposure triangle? So shutter speed is locked now at 1/125. So you have aperture, you have ISO. If your lens is already as open as it goes, if you have an f3.5 and it's already at 3.5, your only other option is to crank up that ISO. So you really don't want to do slow motion in low light situations. You need a huge amount of light to get good quality slow-mo, because as soon as you jack up that shutter speed to account for the new frame rate, you need to end up either opening your aperture, or most likely, in most situations, you'll have to jump up that ISO, bringing in more noise and more grain. So to that point, is slow-mo worth it? Do you need slow motion? No. No, you don't. Peter McKinnon is amazing. He's an extraordinary filmmaker. I love watching his stuff. It's eye candy. It's beautiful. Do you need to use slow motion? No, that's just a tool that Peter's using. You don't need it. You can choose to do B-roll without slow-mo. You can move slowly and learn to lock your elbows in and be really careful. You can set it up on a tripod and slowly turn it around, or you can just not do any of those things. You can just set it up and film static images of lots of different things and cut those together. Lots of different ways to get the job done when the goal is connection and engagement and building an audience and saying something meaningful and saying something worthwhile. The tools we have are just that. You don't need slow-mo. If you want to use it, great. Just don't use it for the sake of doing slow motion. If you want to do color grading, great. Just don't do it for the sake of doing color grading. If you want to use manual everything, fantastic. Just don't do it to feel cool that you're doing it in manual. Only do it if you've got a real reason for it. Only use the tools, the strategies that I've outlined in this video, the settings, if there's a reason for it that's not simply to do it. Otherwise, set everything to auto and make your content. Say something worthwhile. Say something meaningful. Use your voice for something other than toxic negativity. There's plenty of that crap on the internet. Here's something we haven't talked about. Microphones. Do you need an external microphone? You don't need it. But here's where I'm going to change my tune a little bit from the rest of this video. Audio is the most important part of video. We will forgive poor quality video. When we're watching, if there's a grainy video, if it's a little dark, if it's outdated frame rates, whatever. If it's a low quality video, if we're interested in the topic and we can clearly hear what the person is saying, we will forgive poor video. But if there's garbled audio, if there's wind noise, if the audio is cutting in and out, if it's super harsh or brittle, if it's super boomy or echoey, we'll turn that off no matter how beautiful the 4K slow-mo 120p B-roll looks. I don't care if you were in the mountain, if you were in outer space, I don't care. If I can't hear you, if I have to strain to figure out what the heck you're saying, I don't care. Audio really matters, especially when it comes to connecting and engaging with an audience. So there are microphones built into cameras. There's a microphone built into your smartphone. There's a microphone built into a point and shoot. There's microphones built into the cameras. They're not great. This, for example, is what it sounds like when I'm using the inbuilt microphones right now. If this is all I had is this camera, the GX85, which would be a phenomenal camera if it's all you had, right? You should be so lucky to have a camera like this. If this is all you had and you didn't have another microphone, this is the sound you'd be getting. Now, is it passable? Yeah, of course, it's passable. You can hear me, right? You can hear what I'm saying. It's fine. It's not great. It's a little far away because I'm a little far away. There's no echo because I'm luckily sitting in a fully treated, acoustically treated studio. But you know, if you were in a living room or something, you'd hear some echo, but like it would be fine. If that's what you got, use it and upgrade when you can. Plus, this camera doesn't have a mic input. Couldn't add a microphone to it if I wanted to. I would need to have an external audio recorder with a microphone, and that starts to get a lot more complicated and much more expensive. If you're only using internal mics, do your best to set the level. If you have manual audio controls, at least set the level so that you're getting so that you're not clipping, that you're not distorting. A lot of times, if your audio is set to auto, it'll distort constantly. So if you have an option for manual audio, manual input gain, set it so that the input gain, so that the audio is between -9 and -12 dB. That gives us lots of what we call headroom. Headroom is the difference between the loudest audio and 0, which is a brick wall in audio. If any of your audio hits 0 in the digital audio world, it clips and distorts and gets garbled and sounds awful and horrible and terrible, and don't do that. If you can set your audio to manual, make sure that you're just keeping between -9 and -12 dB, gives you plenty of headroom, and then you can just boost the volume in post a little bit. But if you have a microphone input, then if you can afford it, please use an external microphone. The two types of external mics you would find in the vlogging world are an on-camera shotgun mic. This particular one is the Movo VXR10. It's my personal choice. I've tried most of them on the market. Very popular is the Rode Video Micro. I have one. I used it for a while. I enjoyed it. I like this better, but if you can afford it, I highly recommend doing an external mic. The difference is huge. In fact, let me give you an example right now. Here's an example. So right now I'm talking into the G85 with the Movo VXR10 sitting on top. I'm about 12 inches away, which is about how far away you'd be for recording a vlog, and this is what it sounds like with the external microphone. And now sitting in the exact same situation, you're hearing the inbuilt microphones on the G85. These are the microphones built into the camera, and this is how it sounds in the exact same situation. And one more time back to the Movo VXR10, an external microphone recording in this situation. See how much cleaner and clearer it sounds? That's some good stuff. And one more great advantage of having one of these shotgun mics is that you can also rig it up as a boom mic, so you can rig it up with a very, very cheap microphone stand right out of frame, right over your head, to get really crisp, clear audio when you're doing a talking head shot like this, if you didn't want to use the other type of mic, which is a lav mic. Lav microphones clip onto your lav microphones clip onto your shirt or somewhere kind of on your clothing, and these are omnidirectional, whereas the shotgun microphones are typically unidirectional. They record mostly from the front, a little bit from the sides, but nothing from the back. So they're great if you have some background noise, if you're in a loud place, a noisy place, if you've got some other stuff going on. You can pretty much just angle yourself talking to the camera towards wherever the sound is. If there's some crappy noise over there, you talk at it, and the crappy noise is off axis to the microphone, so it won't capture most of what's back there. It'll mostly just capture your voice. That's the beauty of these. Well, the pro and con of a lav mic is that they're omnidirectional. They pick up from 360. They pick up from all sides in every direction. That's great because you don't have to be too specific about where you put it, and if you put it right here, if you put it right here, if you put it here, you don't have to angle it towards your voice. So that's great, but the downside is that if there's crappy noise over there, or over there, or over there, or over there, it's gonna pick up everything, not just your voice. So you do wanna get a lav mic about as close to your voice as you can without getting it right on it. You don't really want it, like if you can avoid having it right here, you'd be for the better, because if you put a lav mic this close to your voice, it tends to get really extra bassy and rumbly. This is usually about the right distance for a natural sound. Lav mics are great because they're relatively inexpensive. Like these days, you can spend $20, $30 and pick up a cheap lav mic that'll plug right into your camera or smartphone. And for that, you can get much, much higher quality audio. Now, if you don't have a microphone input on your camera and you still want to get better audio using a lav mic, you just have to get a lav mic that works with a smartphone, and then use your smartphone's audio recorder, because you have a voice memo app or an audio recorder built into every smartphone, and just use that to record and then sync the audio in post, which is very simple to do. I'm not going to talk you through that in this video. I'll leave a link in the description to a tutorial I did somewhere else on how to sync audio and video. Very, very easy, takes 2 minutes. One thing to be aware of with microphones, there are two types of connectors, TRS and TRRS. TRS stands for tip ring sleeve. Those are the connectors, those are the cables that go into cameras. TRRS, tip ring sleeve, those connectors go into smartphones, tablets, and computers. You cannot plug them into the opposite one. Not a good idea. Lighting. Did you notice that in that previous section, something changed with the lighting? I love to pretend like I planned that all along, but in truth, I had to stop recording, take a 10-minute break because I had already been recording for an hour and 10 minutes straight with no break. And when I came back, I realized I forgot to turn on one of my two lights, which is right over here. And now you'll notice that there's a more even lighting on my face. Lighting is phenomenally important when it comes to video. Now, if you're running and gunning, vlogging, you're just gonna have to deal with the light that you have. If you're out there in the real world, what you wanna do is you wanna be facing where the light source is. You don't ever wanna be backlit. You don't want the lighting source coming from behind you. So if the sun is over there, I wanna be talking to the camera this way or in this general direction. You don't wanna be facing that way if the sun is over there. Likewise, if you're inside, but it's a bright day and you want to get some good natural light so you don't have to crank your ISO, go over to a window, get right up on a window and record, because the sun hits the window and diffuses and you get this beautiful, soft, even lighting coming in through big big windows. The disadvantage to doing that is that as the light changes, goes behind the cloud, gets brighter, it's gonna mess with your exposure. But the advantage is it's free because it's the sun. All right, I think we covered as much as we could possibly cover in one single foundational video about vlogging in 2020. It's 2020. You can use almost anything and get video that even 10 years ago we couldn't dream of. It's just a miracle age to be in when it comes to video. So if you want to get into the gear and into the settings, if you really enjoy the creative process of using cameras and doing film work and color and all these things, then yeah, go for it. Learn the settings, get the gear, get an education and find out what kind of cool creative, what you can create using those tools. But if you just want to do a vlog to say something, to have an impact on the world, to do work that matters for people who care, to develop an audience and a tribe of people who trust you and challenge you and enjoy your perspective and share theirs and grow and evolve with you, then man, just use what you got and upgrade when you can. Anyway, I really hope this was useful. My name is Brian Miller. As I said at the very beginning of this video, I was a professional magician for the better part of 10 years, transitioned with my TEDx talk that went viral in 2015, became very, very popular, into being an author. My first book, 3 New People, is available. You can see that in the description. It's a plea for humanity in an increasingly divisive world. I write a weekly blog to help young professionals and young adults strengthen your relationships, connect with anyone, and build a sustainable career. I also run a podcast that is, in its first year was called One New Person. It is now being just rebranded a little bit. You can check that out for incredible conversations with legends and leaders of fields about how to, again, build a sustainable career in an increasingly unpredictable world that's becoming more reliant on automation and more distracted and more divisive. Anyway, thanks so much for sticking with me. My name is Brian Miller, and always remember that our world is a shared experience. See you next time.